There is a question I want you to answer honestly before this video begins. Have you ever felt something you could only call sacred in a place where you were told God wasn't? Standing at the edge of the ocean at night, watching a storm roll across a mountain range, holding a newborn for the first time, looking up at a sky so full of stars that your own problems briefly stopped existing, walking through a forest so old and so quiet that something in you went quiet too, and then going back to church or temple or mosque and feeling, not for the first time, that whatever you felt out there was more real, more alive, more genuinely sacred than anything happening in here. If you have felt that, you have felt what Baruch Spinoza spent his entire life trying to articulate. And what he found when he followed that feeling to its philosophical conclusion was so radical, so precise, and so threatening to every religious institution in Europe that they banned his books, burned his name, and called him the most dangerous man alive. Not because he denied God, because he found God everywhere, in everything, with a philosophical rigor so airtight that 3 centuries later Einstein would read it and say, "Yes, that is what the physics is pointing at. That is the God I believe in." What Spinoza discovered has a name: Pantheism, from the Greek pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. All is God. God is all. Not a being who created the universe and now watches it from outside, but the universe itself, understood from the inside, as the self-expression of an infinite, eternal, necessary reality that has no outside. And by the end of this video, you will understand why that idea is not just philosophically interesting. It is personally transformative. It changes what you are, what you owe, what you can hope for, and why the sacred feeling you have been chasing your entire life was never somewhere else. It was always here. It has always been you. Let us start with the trap. Most people in the modern world live between 2 options that both feel wrong. Option 1, the personal God of institutional religion, a being who exists outside the universe, who created it, who has specific preferences about human behavior, who answers some prayers and ignores others, who rewards the obedient and punishes the disobedient, and who has authorized specific institutions to speak in his name and manage access to his favor. For many people, this God stopped making sense a long time ago. The suffering that this God permits, the prayers that this God ignores, the wars that have been fought in this God's name, the institutions that have claimed this God's authority while doing things this God's own teachings condemn, the sheer implausibility. For a mind that has seen what science has revealed about the age and scale and complexity of the universe, of a personal being who cares specifically about the behavior of one species on one planet in one galaxy among hundreds of billions. And yet, something remains. The experience itself, the undeniable fact that when you stood at the edge of that ocean, something happened that the word emotion does not fully capture, something that felt like contact rather than projection, like recognition rather than invention. Option 2, atheism. There is no God. The universe is a blind mechanism that produced complexity by accident. Consciousness is a byproduct of neurons that will stop when the neurons stop. Meaning is a story we tell ourselves. Love is biochemistry. Beauty is a survival mechanism. And the sacred feeling you have been chasing your entire life is a neurological quirk that evolution found useful. For many people, this option is worse than the first, because even if the personal God is philosophically incoherent, at least it takes seriously the reality of the experience, the feeling that there is something more, that the universe is not indifferent, that what you felt standing at the edge of that ocean was not nothing. Both options leave you stranded. The personal God requires you to believe things your honest mind cannot sustain. The atheist void requires you to dismiss experiences that feel more real than most of what passes for fact. Spinoza refuses both options, and what he offers instead is not a compromise between them. It is something categorically different from either. He says, the personal God of institutional religion is too small. A God who exists outside the universe, who intervenes in it occasionally, who has preferences and responds to petitions, is a finite being dressed in infinite clothing. A God who can be petitioned is a God who changes. A God who changes is subject to time. A God subject to time is inside the universe, not its ground. And he says, the atheist God of blind mechanism is too empty. A universe that produced consciousness capable of understanding its own nature, that operates according to mathematical laws of breathtaking elegance, that expresses patterns of such extraordinary beauty that every honest scientist has, at some point, felt something they could only call awe, is not well described as a blind accident. Something is going on in this universe that the word accident does not capture. What Spinoza offers is this: one infinite substance, neither inside the universe nor outside it, identical with it, expressing itself as it. The universe is not something God made. The universe is what God is doing, necessarily, eternally, without exception. Deus, Sive, Natura, God or nature, two names for one infinite reality. Now here is what makes this genuinely radical rather than just poetically appealing. If God is identical with nature, then the laws of nature are not rules God imposed on the universe from outside. They are the expression of God's own eternal character. The law of gravity is not a policy that God decided to implement. It is what God's infinite nature does when it expresses itself in the mode of mass and space. The mathematical structure of quantum mechanics is not a description of how God's creation behaves. It is a partial description of what God is. And if that is true, then the scientist who maps the structure of DNA is doing something genuinely sacred, not in the sentimental sense of all knowledge being wonderful, in the precise philosophical sense that they are reading the character of God directly, without institutional mediation, in the most reliable language available to a human mind, mathematics. This is exactly what Einstein felt. He said it repeatedly and in multiple contexts, that doing physics was, for him, a genuinely religious experience. That the mathematical elegance of the laws of nature produced in him something he could only call reverence. That the universe's comprehensibility, the fact that a human mind could read its structure at all, was the deepest mystery and the deepest source of wonder he knew. And when someone asked him what God he believed in, he said without hesitation, Spinoza's God, the God who is identical with the order and harmony of what exists, not the God who rewards and punishes, not the God who intervenes, the God who is. Now I want to ask you something directly. Think about the moments in your life when you felt most genuinely alive, most genuinely connected to something larger than yourself, most genuinely at peace in a way that had nothing to do with your circumstances being good. Were those moments inside institutions? Or were they in nature? In music? In the wordless presence of someone you loved? In a moment of understanding so clear it felt like the world briefly showed you its actual face? Write it in the comments. One sentence. The moment and what it felt like. because what you felt in that moment was not less than what the mystics describe. It was not less than what Einstein felt in his equations. It was the infinite substance recognizing itself through a finite consciousness momentarily open enough to notice. That is what Spinoza says you are. Not a creature God made and placed in the world. A mode of the infinite substance that is God. A temporary, particular, irreplaceable configuration of the only thing there is, capable of wondering about its own nature. Now let us talk about why this terrified religious institutions more than atheism ever did. Atheism is easy to fight. It denies God. The institution simply defends God's existence and points to the experience of the sacred that atheism cannot explain. The battle lines are clear. Believers on one side, non-believers on the other. Pantheism is a different problem entirely, because pantheism does not deny God. It finds God everywhere, and finding God everywhere means finding God outside the institution. In the forest, in the ocean, in the equations of physics, in the direct experience of consciousness encountering the depth of what is. A person who finds God everywhere does not need an institution to mediate access to God, does not need sacraments to connect with the divine, does not need a priest or a rabbi or an imam to tell them what God requires, does not need to pay tithes or perform rituals or submit to doctrinal authority to be in right relationship with the infinite. They already are in right relationship with the infinite. By virtue of existing, by virtue of being a mode of the infinite substance that is God. This is why Spinoza's pantheism was more threatening to institutional religion than atheism. Atheism empties the world of the sacred. Pantheism fills it so completely that the institution's claim to exclusive access becomes not just false, but absurd. You cannot own what is everywhere. You cannot charge admission to what you are already inside of. You cannot be the gatekeeper of a reality that has no gates. Now let us talk about what pantheism actually means for how you live, because this is where the philosophy stops being abstract and starts being genuinely transformative. If every person you encounter is a mode of the same infinite substance that you are, then the separation between you and them is not absolute. It is real at the level of individual modes. You are not them and they are not you. But at the level of the substance you both express, you are not separate. The boundary between you is constructed by the limitations of your perspective, not by the ultimate nature of what you both are. This has an ethical consequence that Spinoza spells out with unusual clarity. When you harm another person, you are not harming something separate from the infinite substance that you are. You are harming a different mode of the same substance, which means, in the deepest possible sense, you are harming yourself, not metaphorically, structurally, because the substance you are diminishing is the same substance you are. And when you genuinely understand this, not as an intellectual position but as a lived recognition, your relationship to other people changes. Not because you decide to be nicer, because the perception of absolute separation that makes cruelty and indifference possible begins to dissolve. And what remains is something that every wisdom tradition in human history has pointed at as the foundation of genuine ethical life, the recognition that the other is not other in the way you thought. Think about what this means concretely. The person who irritates you most, the one whose politics you find incomprehensible, whose values seem foreign, whose choices you cannot understand. In Spinoza's pantheism, that person is a mode of the same infinite substance you are, expressing itself differently, with different limitations, different history, different access to understanding, but the same substance, the same God, if you want to use that word, wearing a different face. This does not mean you have to agree with them, or that their choices are equally wise, or that difference dissolves into sameness. Spinoza is not a relativist. He believes there are better and worse ways of expressing the infinite substance, more and less adequate configurations of consciousness. But the contempt that makes cruelty possible, the radical othering that allows you to treat another human being as if their suffering does not matter, that becomes much harder to sustain when you genuinely see what they are at the deepest level. The same thing you are. The infinite, looking back at you through different eyes. This is what the mystics have always said. Meister Eckhart said, God and the soul are not two but one. The Sufi mystics spoke of fana, the dissolution of the individual self into the divine. The Hindu Advaita tradition says Atman is Brahman. The individual self is identical with the universal self. The Buddhist teaching of interdependence says nothing exists independently. Everything arises in mutual dependence within a single web of reality. What is extraordinary is that these traditions developed completely independently. A Christian mystic in medieval Germany, a Sufi poet in Persia, a Hindu philosopher in ancient India, a Buddhist monk in Tibet. None of them read each other. None of them shared a cultural framework. And all of them arrived at the same place. That convergence is not a coincidence. It is what happens when a human mind pushes its experience of the sacred to its deepest level. The boundary between self and other dissolves. The boundary between inside and outside dissolves. What remains is not nothing. It is everything, experienced as one thing. Spinoza said the same thing. In the language of 17th-century European rationalism, with the precision of a geometer and the courage of someone willing to pay the full price of intellectual honesty, and quantum physics is now saying something structurally similar, that particles which have interacted remain correlated across arbitrarily large distances, that the universe at its most fundamental level is not a collection of separate things but something more like an entangled whole in which separateness itself is a kind of approximation, that what we perceive as isolated objects are patterns in a field that is itself one thing. The mystic experienced it. The philosopher deduced it. The physicist measured it. 3 completely different methods. The same conclusion. When that happens, when completely independent lines of inquiry converge on the same point, that point is probably real, probably more real than any single method could establish on its own. The mystic, the philosopher, and the physicist are arriving at the same place from 3 completely different directions. That is not coincidence. That is the signature of something real. Now, here is the question that reveals whether you already believe what Spinoza believed. Do you think the sacred feeling you have felt in nature, in music, in genuine love, in moments of extraordinary clarity, is a real perception of something real? Or is it a neurological artifact with no object outside the brain that produced it? If you think it is real, if you think that what you felt standing at the edge of that ocean was a genuine encounter with something that is actually there, then you are already committed to something very close to what Spinoza says. Because what else could that something be, if not the infinite substance expressing itself in you and recognized by you in everything around you? You may not have had the philosophical framework for it. You may not have had the vocabulary. You may have been told that what you felt was emotion rather than perception, sentiment rather than insight, wishful thinking rather than genuine contact with what is. Spinoza says, you were right and they were wrong. What you felt was real, more real than most of what passes for religious experience inside the institutions that claim to own access to the divine, because what you felt was direct, unmediated, not transmitted through institutional authority or doctrinal framework or sacramental system, but encountered immediately, in the direct contact between your consciousness and the infinite substance of which it is a mode. That is pantheism, not the sentimental idea that nature is pretty and we should appreciate it. The precise philosophical claim that what you encountered in those moments is God, the only God there is, the God that is not somewhere else waiting to be accessed through the right rituals, the God that is here, always, in everything, including in you, right now. And if this channel is where you want to continue exploring this territory, subscribe now, because Spinoza opened something that is still being explored, still being deepened, still being discovered by minds willing to follow the question wherever it leads. Before the mantra, I want to leave you with something that captures what pantheism means, not as a philosophical position, but as a lived experience. You have been looking for God your entire life, in churches and temples and sacred texts, in prayer and ritual and doctrine, in the testimony of authorities who claimed to know where God was and what God wanted. And in those moments when you felt most genuinely alive, most genuinely connected, most genuinely at peace, you were not in any of those places. You were at the edge of the ocean, or under a sky full of stars, or in the wordless presence of someone you loved, or in a moment so ordinary it should not have felt sacred but did. Spinoza says, that was not a distraction from God. That was God, recognizing itself through you, in the only way the infinite can ever be encountered by a finite mind, directly, immediately, without mediation, in the ordinary moments when the ordinary world briefly shows you its extraordinary depth. You were never outside of God. You never could be. You are a mode of the only substance there is, and every moment of genuine wonder, genuine love, genuine understanding, is the infinite substance recognizing itself through you. That is what Spinoza discovered. That is what Einstein confirmed. That is what the mystics of every tradition have been pointing at for as long as human beings have been capable of pointing at anything. The mantra that captures what pantheism means when you stop treating it as philosophy and start living it. I am not separate from what created me. Write it in the comments, or write the moment when you felt what Spinoza is describing, the place where you found God without looking for him, where the sacred showed up without an invitation in a moment that should have been ordinary, because that moment was not an accident. It was not sentiment. It was not wishful thinking. It was the most accurate perception available to a human mind. The direct encounter with what is, with what you are, with the only God there has ever been. The next exploration is waiting for you on screen right now, chosen specifically to take what you understood here one level further. Spinoza did not find God by looking harder in the places he was told God lived. He found God by following the argument honestly until there was nowhere left to look except everywhere. Start there. Start now. And here is what makes Spinoza's pantheism different from every other version of the same idea. Most pantheistic thinking is vague. It says God is everywhere in a way that feels poetic but cannot be defended against a serious philosophical challenge. It collapses under pressure into either a personal God in disguise or a meaningless assertion that everything is sacred without specifying what that means or what follows from it. Spinoza's pantheism is not vague. It is one of the most precisely argued philosophical systems ever constructed. He begins with definitions. He derives axioms. He proves propositions from those axioms with the rigor of a mathematician. And the conclusion he reaches is not a feeling, or an intuition, or a spiritual aspiration. It is a logical consequence of the most carefully examined premises he could find. This is why Einstein did not say he believed in something like Spinoza's God or something in the neighborhood of Spinoza's God. He said, Spinoza's God. Precisely. Because precision was what both men had in common. And precision was what the question demanded. You do not have to master Spinoza's philosophical system to access what he found. But you do have to be willing to take seriously the experiences that pointed him there. The same experiences that have pointed mystics and scientists and ordinary people in every culture and every century toward the same recognition. That the universe is not indifferent. That what you feel in the presence of genuine beauty or genuine love or genuine understanding is a real perception of something real. That the sacred is not somewhere else. It is here. It has always been here. It is what here is made of. If you know someone who describes themselves as spiritual but not religious, someone who has left institutional faith but has not left the sense that something sacred underlies reality, share this video with them. Because Spinoza is the philosopher who gave that experience its most rigorous defense, and knowing that the most precise philosophical mind of the 17th century, confirmed by the most precise scientific mind of the 20th, arrived at the same place they are standing, is not nothing. It is the kind of intellectual companionship that makes it easier to stay honest about what you actually believe. The mantra that captures what pantheism means when you stop treating it as philosophy and start living it. I am not separate from what created me. Write it in the comments. Or write the moment when you felt what Spinoza is describing. The place where you found God without looking for him. Where the sacred showed up without an invitation in a moment that should have been ordinary. Because that moment was not an accident. It was not sentiment. It was not wishful thinking. It was the most accurate perception available to a human mind. The direct encounter with what is. With what you are. With the only God there has ever been. The next exploration is waiting for you on screen right now. Chosen specifically to take what you understood here one level further. Spinoza did not find God by looking harder in the places he was told God lived. He found God by following the argument honestly until there was nowhere left to look except everywhere. Start there. Start now. And one more thing before you go. Something that Spinoza would once said clearly. Pantheism does not make everything equal. It does not mean that a moment of genuine love and a moment of cruelty are the same because both are expressions of God. It does not mean that wisdom and ignorance are equivalent because both are modes of the infinite substance. It does not mean that your choices do not matter because whatever you choose is God choosing. That is a misreading that Spinoza spends considerable effort correcting. What pantheism means is that the infinite substance expresses itself in modes of varying adequacy. Some configurations of consciousness understand more. Some understand less. Some act in ways that increase the power and joy and freedom of the modes they encounter. Some act in ways that diminish it. And the difference between those two is not irrelevant just because both are expressions of the same substance. It is the most important difference there is. The pantheist is not someone who has transcended ethics by recognizing that everything is God. The pantheist is someone whose ethics has been deepened by recognizing that the person in front of them is not other than God, which makes harming them not a transgression of an external rule but a failure to recognize what is actually there. This is what Spinoza means when he calls the highest human state the intellectual love of God. Not the passive appreciation of everything as equally divine, but the active, rigorous, honest engagement with the nature of what is, that generates from within the ethical behavior that external rules can only impose from without. The person who genuinely sees the infinite in every person they encounter does not need to be commanded to love their neighbor. Love is the natural response to seeing clearly. And seeing clearly is what pantheism, done honestly, is the practice of. That is Spinoza's God. Not distant, not absent, not manageable by any institution, not accessible only through the right rituals or the right beliefs or the right authorities. Here, always, in everything, including in you, right now, looking back at itself through your eyes. Now here is the question that will tell you whether pantheism is just an interesting idea or something that actually changes how you move through the world. Tomorrow morning, before anything else happens, look out a window. It does not matter what you see. A garden or a parking lot, a mountain or a wall, whatever is there. And ask yourself honestly, is this God? Not is this beautiful? Not is this impressive? Is this the infinite substance expressing itself in this particular mode at this particular moment? If the answer feels like yes, even tentatively, even just as a possibility worth taking seriously, then notice what happens to your relationship with what you are looking at. Notice whether the ordinary becomes slightly less ordinary. Whether what you are about to dismiss or ignore or walk past without seeing becomes something that demands a different quality of attention. That shift in attention is what Spinoza is pointing at. Not a theological position to be affirmed. A practice of seeing that, sustained over time, changes the quality of presence you bring to your own life. The sacred is not somewhere you have to go. It is what you are already standing in. Spinoza spent his entire life, at enormous personal cost, trying to show you that. Einstein confirmed it with his equations. The mystics confirmed it with their experience. And you may have been confirming it yourself every time you felt something in a place where you were told God was not. You were right. They were wrong. God was exactly where you felt it. That is pantheism. That is Spinoza. And that is the God that has been waiting for you not in any institution but in the honest encounter with what is. Before the mantra, I want to leave you with something that captures what pantheism means not as a philosophical position but as a lived experience. You have been looking for God your entire life. In churches and temples and sacred texts, in prayer and ritual and doctrine, in the testimony of authorities who claimed to know where God was and what God wanted, and in those moments when you felt most genuinely alive, most genuinely connected, most genuinely at peace, you were not in any of those places. You were at the edge of the ocean, or under a sky full of stars, or in the wordless presence of someone you loved, or in a moment so ordinary it should not have felt sacred but did. Spinoza says, that was not a distraction from God. That was God, recognizing itself through you. In the only way the infinite can ever be encountered by a finite mind, directly, immediately, without mediation, in the ordinary moments when the ordinary world briefly shows you its extraordinary depth. You were never outside of God. You never could be. You are a mode of the only substance there is. And every moment of genuine wonder, genuine love, genuine understanding, is the infinite substance recognizing itself through you. That is what Spinoza discovered. That is what Einstein confirmed. That is what the mystics of every tradition have been pointing at for as long as human beings have been capable of pointing at anything. I am not separate from what created me. Write it in the comments. Or write the moment when you felt what Spinoza is describing. The place where you found God without looking for him. Where the sacred showed up without an invitation in a moment that should have been ordinary. The next exploration is waiting for you on screen right now. Spinoza did not find God by looking harder in the places he was told God lived. He found God by following the argument honestly until there was nowhere left to look except everywhere. Start there. Start now. And one final thought for the person watching this who grew up religious and left, who walked away from the institution but has never been able to walk away from the feeling that something sacred underlies reality, who has been living in an uncomfortable middle ground between a faith they could not sustain and an atheism that felt like settling for less than what they actually experience. Spinoza is not asking you to go back. He is not asking you to return to the institution that stopped making sense. He is not asking you to pretend to believe things your honest mind cannot sustain. He is asking you to trust what you already feel, to take seriously the experiences that the institution dismissed as sentiment and the atheist dismisses as neurological noise, to follow those experiences honestly, philosophically, rigorously, wherever they lead. And where they lead, he found, is not back to the institution, and not to the void, but to something that is more God than the institution ever offered and more real than the void ever admitted. The universe is not indifferent. It is what indifference is made of, along with everything else, including love and beauty and consciousness and the capacity to wonder about your own nature. And you are not a stranger in it. You are what it looks like from the inside when it becomes aware of itself. That is not nothing. That is everything. And it was always here, waiting for you to be honest enough to see it.